The November rain had been falling since noon, a steady, cold drizzle that turned the streets of Scranton into glistening ribbons of asphalt under the dull glow of streetlights. Michelle Carter stepped off the second bus of her commute, her arms aching from the weight of two bulging grocery bags. The wind bit at her cheeks as she walked the final 2 blocks toward the modest townhouse she and her family had called home for nearly a decade. It was past 7. Her day had begun before dawn. A quick breakfast, a long ride to the manufacturing firm where she worked as an accountant, 8 hours of spreadsheets and numbers, another ride home. And now this. The heavy bags were more than just food for the week. They were a physical reminder of everything she carried that no one else seemed to notice. Inside, the living room was exactly as she expected. Dim light, muted sports commentary drifting from the television, and Brian stretched out on the couch in the same faded sweatpants he'd worn yesterday, and probably the day before that. He barely glanced up when she came in. "Hey," he muttered, eyes fixed on the screen. There was no offer to help with the bags, no question about her day. Just the same couch, the same remote, the same man who had once been so different. 2 years ago, Brian Carter had been a sales manager with a knack for closing deals and a head full of plans. When the company downsized, he'd come home with a cardboard box of belongings and a promise. This was temporary. He would find something else, something better. But weeks became months, and months became years. Now, temporary felt like a lie neither of them had the strength to expose. "I had an interview today," Brian said after a pause, still not looking at her. Didn't feel like the right fit. It was the same phrase he always used. Michelle set the bags on the counter, forcing her voice to stay calm. What was wrong with it? Too small. They're looking for someone with less experience. He shrugged, flipping the channel. "I'm not going to settle." Michelle didn't argue. She'd learned there was no point. Every opportunity was too small, too far, too beneath his level. Somewhere along the way, ambition had turned into pride, and pride had hardened into inertia. It wasn't just about money anymore. It was about watching the man she had built a life with disappear one excuse at a time. Upstairs, her children's voices carried faintly through the hall. Lucas, 16, and Emma, 14. They had long stopped waiting for their father to drive them to practice or help with school projects. Lucas did odd jobs after school to pay for his own sneakers. Emma confided in Michelle when she was upset, never Brian. Still, Brian lectured them endlessly about the importance of education and responsibility, as if words could fill the gap his absence left. Michelle moved through the motions of her evening without thinking. Groceries into the fridge, pasta boiling on the stove, laundry sorted and switched. Emma called from her room with a question about a biology assignment. Lucas asked if they could afford the $40 for a school field trip. "We'll figure it out," Michelle said automatically, though she wasn't sure how. When dinner was ready, she set the table while Brian continued watching TV. He joined them eventually, complaining half-heartedly about the pasta being overcooked. Lucas stared at his plate. Emma ate in silence. The only sound was the clinking of forks against dishes and the muffled chatter from the television in the other room. After dinner, Michelle scrubbed dishes while Brian returned to the couch. She helped Emma finish her homework, reminded Lucas about his curfew, and prepared lunches for the next day. By the time she folded the last load of laundry, it was past midnight. Brian had fallen asleep with the TV still on. She turned it off and stood there for a moment, watching him. This was the man who used to plan road trips on a whim, who once left her love notes tucked inside her purse, who dreamed of starting his own business. Now he couldn't even take out the trash without being asked twice. Michelle went to bed exhausted, not just from the weight of the groceries or the hours of work, but from the relentless sameness of it all. Her life had become a loop. Work, home, store, repeat. Even weekends brought no rest, just deeper cleaning, more chores, endless lists. Somewhere along the way, she had stopped being a wife and partner and had become something else entirely. A manager, a caretaker, a support system that no one acknowledged until it faltered. As the rain continued to patter softly against the window, Michelle lay awake staring into the darkness. She tried to remember the last time she had felt like more than a machine keeping the household running. The answer didn't come, and that silence, heavy, familiar, suffocating, was worse than any answer could have been. The morning light that filtered through the blinds was pale and cold, carrying none of the warmth Michelle used to love about autumn. She stirred awake before her alarm, a habit formed long ago when mornings were a race against the clock, lunches to pack, kids to wake, clothes to iron. The house was quiet except for a low murmur coming from the living room. As she moved closer, still in her robe, she realized it was Brian's voice. "No, I'm not ready yet," he was saying quietly into the phone. "I need a bit more time." "Yeah, I know, but it's just not the right opportunity right now." Michelle stopped by the doorway, the words landing heavier than they should. Not ready yet. 2 years had passed since he'd lost his job, and still he wasn't ready. When he noticed her standing there, Brian ended the call quickly and offered a weak smile. It was nothing. A recruiter. Wrong fit. She folded her arms. Wrong fit again. He sighed as if she were the unreasonable one. "I'm not taking the first thing that comes along, Michelle. I have standards. I'm not going to waste my time on something that isn't worth it." "Maybe something temporary then," she suggested gently. "Just until—" "No," he cut her off, his voice sharpening. "I'm not flipping burgers or stocking shelves. I've worked too hard for that." The conversation ended the way it always did, with a wall she couldn't climb. Michelle retreated to the kitchen and started breakfast. The scent of coffee soon drew Lucas and Emma downstairs, sleepy-eyed and hungry. Lucas hovered near the fridge, his voice hesitant. "Mom, the school trip to DC is next month. They need the payment by Friday." Emma spoke next, toeing the floor with her sock. "And I need new sneakers. Mine are too small." Michelle's chest tightened. "I'll see what I can do." Brian, reading the news on his phone, didn't look up. Lucas stared at him for a long moment before muttering, "You've been saying that for 2 years." Then he grabbed his backpack and walked out without another word. Silence hung over the kitchen like a storm cloud. Michelle placed a plate in front of Brian, but he barely touched it. They ate in separate worlds, hers filled with mental calculations about bills and groceries, his filled with headlines and job postings he'd never apply to. By the time she reached work, Michelle's head was already pounding. The office buzzed with easy conversation, the kind she had no part in anymore. "We got tickets to see Hamilton this weekend," a colleague was saying. "Then dinner at that new steakhouse downtown." Another was planning a trip to Cape May with her husband. Michelle smiled when they spoke to her, but she couldn't join in. Her weekends weren't for plays or getaways. They were for catching up on laundry, scrubbing bathrooms, buying groceries with coupons, and silently stretching every dollar. Her life, once full of small dreams and shared plans, had narrowed to a list of tasks that never ended. At 5, she clocked out and headed to a small cafe 2 blocks from the office. Lena Rodriguez was already there, waving from a corner booth. Her friend was everything Michelle wasn't these days, vibrant, sharp, unburdened. Divorce had done that for her. After leaving her alcoholic husband, Lena had rebuilt her life from the ground up, and she spoke with the kind of clarity that came from surviving chaos. "You look exhausted," Lena said as Michelle slid into the seat across from her. "Has he even applied anywhere this week?" "He says he's looking," Michelle murmured. "He's just waiting for something that fits." Lena snorted. "Fits? Michelle, men don't change because we ask them to. They change when the alternative hurts. As long as you're carrying the weight, he'll let you." Michelle stirred her tea, slowly, watching the steam curl upward. "It's not that simple. The kids need stability. And you don't." Lena leaned forward. "You deserve a partner, not another dependent." She hesitated, then added, "Someone actually asked about you last week." Said you were beautiful. Wanted to know if you were single. Michelle blinked, caught off guard. What? One of the guys from my office. He saw us having lunch a few months ago. Lena grinned. I told him you weren't available, obviously. But it proves a point. You're not invisible, Michelle. Not to everyone. Michelle laughed it off, waving the comment away. But the word stuck like a splinter she couldn't shake. It had been so long since anyone had seen her as anything other than a mother, a wife, a provider. Somewhere beneath the exhaustion and the routines, a part of her still existed. A woman who once had dreams and desires of her own. As they said their goodbyes and parted ways, Michelle walked home through the chilly evening, Lena's words echoing in her mind. As long as you're carrying the weight, he'll let you. She thought of Brian on the couch, the unopened job applications, the not ready yet excuse. Maybe Lena was right. Maybe she had made it too easy for him not to change. And maybe, just maybe, something had to give. The bus was half empty that evening, its windows fogged from the contrast between the damp November air and the warm interior. Michelle slid into a seat near the back. The grocery bags gone now, but the weight in her chest heavier than ever. The day had drained her, the quiet tension at breakfast, Lucas's bitter remark, Lena's blunt truths echoing in her ears. Outside, the streets of Scranton blurred into streaks of orange and gray as rain clung to the glass. She pressed her forehead against the cool window and let the gentle sway of the bus lull her into thought. 2 seats ahead, a man's voice rose softly above the hum of the engine. He was speaking into his phone, his tone warm, apologetic, tender, a language Michelle hadn't heard in her own home for years. I know, sweetheart, he said with a small laugh. I promised we'd go to Charleston this fall. I'm sorry we have to put off again. A pause, then softer. Thank you for being so patient with me. You're the most understanding woman in the world. You know that. Michelle's eyes drifted to the man, mid-40s, tired around the edges, but smiling as he spoke. He explained how his mother's condition had worsened, how he needed to spend weekends at her house now. It's not how I pictured this year, he murmured. But I'm lucky. Not everyone has a partner who stands by them like you do. The words pierced deeper than she expected. She turned back to the rain-streaked window, but the conversation had already carved its way inside her. Thank you. I'm sorry. I'm lucky. Simple phrases, ordinary even. And yet, when was the last time she had heard them directed at her? 2 years ago, Brian's company had folded, and with it their sense of stability. She told herself then that they would weather the storm together. She'd worked extra hours, cut corners, reassured the children, held everything together so Brian could figure things out. But somewhere along the way, the storm had become permanent and gratitude had vanished. There were no thank yous for the meals she prepared after 10-hour shifts. No apologies for the strain of bills piling higher than their hopes. No acknowledgement that she was the only one rowing the boat anymore. Michelle tried to remember the last time Brian had touched her shoulder in passing or kissed her cheek without being asked. She came up blank. Their conversations now were lists and logistics, school forms, grocery needs, overdue payments. They were partners in name only, their marriage a silent agreement to coexist in the same space. The man ahead kept talking, his voice full of affection and remorse. I promise we'll plan something for spring. Maybe that cabin you love by the lake. Just us. You deserve that more than anyone. Michelle felt her throat tighten. Deserve? Did she deserve anything anymore? A thank you? A break? A life that wasn't just an endless conveyor belt of responsibilities? It was unsettling how foreign the idea felt. The bus lurched to a stop, and a few passengers shuffled off. Michelle barely noticed. Her mind had snagged on a thought Lena had planted earlier. As long as you're carrying the weight, he'll let you. It had stung when she'd heard it. It stung even more now. Maybe she had been protecting Brian from consequences, cushioning his fall, smoothing over every rough edge so he could keep drifting. And maybe in doing so, she had erased herself. She stared at her reflection in the dark glass. Tired eyes, hair damp from the rain, a face she barely recognized anymore. Beneath the exhaustion, though, something stirred. A small, stubborn ember of anger, of curiosity. What would happen if she stopped carrying the weight, even for a single day? If the meals weren't cooked, the clothes weren't folded, the lists weren't checked off? What would Brian do if she simply disappeared from the equation? Would he notice her absence, or just the absence of what she did? The bus turned down Maple Avenue, nearing her stop. The man with the phone call stood and offered his seat to an older woman boarding. He smiled, kind and effortless, before stepping off into the rain. Michelle watched him go, still hearing his words. "I'm lucky. You're the most understanding woman in the world." It wasn't envy that burned in her chest, not exactly. It was something sharper, more unsettling, a realization of how much she had stopped expecting, and how much she had allowed herself to disappear. As the bus hissed to a stop near her block, Michelle rose slowly, gripping the handrail as if steadying herself against a shift she couldn't yet name. The night air met her like a cold slap when she stepped off, rain misting against her skin. She walked the final stretch home without rushing, each footstep deliberate. For the first time in years, her mind wasn't replaying tomorrow's tasks or next week's bills. Instead, a single question pulsed quietly beneath everything else, persistent and impossible to ignore. What would happen if I stopped being invisible, even for one day? Saturday dawned gray and quiet, the kind of morning that begged for coffee and warm blankets. Michelle was awake long before the sun climbed over the rooftops, moving through the house in silence. She slipped into a pair of worn jeans and her favorite coat, packed nothing but her wallet and keys, and paused at the kitchen counter. There, on a yellow sticky note, she wrote 7 simple words. "I have things to do. I'll be back tonight." Then she placed the note where Brian would see it, turned off her phone, and walked out the door. It was the first time in 15 years that she had left the house without a plan, without an explanation, without anyone depending on her. The November air was cool and damp. The streets still empty as Michelle walked with no particular destination. A strange sense of lightness followed her, unfamiliar but intoxicating, like she had set down a load she didn't realize she'd been carrying. She didn't know what the day would bring, and for once she didn't need to. Inside the Carter house, Brian stirred awake hours later. He glanced at the clock, 9:17. Late even for him. The house was too still. No scent of coffee drifting from the kitchen, no clatter of pans, no Michelle calling up the stairs for the kids to get moving. He lay there for a moment, blinking into the silence before pulling himself up and padding downstairs. The sticky note on the counter was the first thing he saw. "I have things to do. I'll be back tonight." That was it. No explanation. No details. Just absence. "Michelle!" he called out, even though he knew she wasn't there. He checked the garage. Her car was gone. Her phone wasn't on the charger. A ripple of unease passed through him. Lucas appeared in the doorway, hair tousled from sleep. "Where's Mom?" "She went out," Brian said uncertainly. Said she'd be back later. Emma followed, clutching a blanket. "But it's Saturday. She always makes pancakes on Saturdays." Brian tried to sound casual. "We'll make breakfast." How hard can it be? It turned out to be harder than he thought. The eggs burned on one side and remained slimy on the other. The toast was blackened. The coffee grounds overflowed. Lucas poked at his plate. "We can't eat this." "Fine," Brian muttered, scraping the mess into the trash. "Cereal it is." But there was no milk. The small inconveniences multiplied as the morning dragged on. The sink filled with dishes because no one thought to load the dishwasher. Laundry sat forgotten in the machine, damp and beginning to smell. Trash overflowed. Emma couldn't find her soccer uniform. Lucas asked how to work the washing machine, and Brian realized he didn't even know which setting to use. Michelle had always handled all of it, not just the meals and cleaning, but the invisible machinery that kept their lives functioning. Now, with her gone, the house felt like a machine with its gears jammed. By noon, Brian was sweating over the stove again, trying to salvage lunch from what little he could manage. Grease splattered his shirt. Emma was crying upstairs over a missing sock. Lucas slammed a door, frustrated by the chaos. Brian sat at the kitchen table, staring at the mess around him, the sticky countertops, the overflowing trash, the pile of unopened mail. For the first time in 2 years, he felt the true weight of everything Michelle had been carrying. His phone buzzed on the table. It was Victor, a colleague from his old job. "Hey man, been a while," Victor said cheerfully. "Listen, there's a position opening up over at Keystone Building Supplies. Client manager. Not glamorous, but decent pay, steady work. You interested?" Brian's instinct was to say no. Too small, not worth it beneath his experience. That's what he'd said every other time. But then he looked around. The burned pan on the stove, the laundry still undone, the cereal bowls piled in the sink. Lucas was stomping down the stairs again. Emma shouted something from her room, and Michelle was nowhere to be found. "Let's talk," Brian heard himself say, surprising even himself. "Maybe it's time." Meanwhile, across town, Michelle wandered through the streets of downtown Scranton like a tourist in her own city. She stopped at a bakery and ate breakfast alone, savoring each bite without rushing. She wandered into a bookstore she used to love and spent an hour leafing through novels she hadn't had the energy to read in years. At August Park, she sat by the pond and watched ducks skim the surface of the water. It was a strange, gentle day, not extraordinary but deeply unfamiliar. With every hour, she felt more like herself and less like the exhausted ghost she had become. For the first time in years, she wasn't answering to anyone, solving anyone's problems or filling anyone else's needs. She was simply existing. In the afternoon, she called her father and asked if he was free for coffee. "For you?" "Always," he said. They met at a small diner near his house, a place with cracked vinyl booths and the smell of fresh pie. Her father looked older than she remembered, his hair thinner and hands more lined, but his eyes softened when he saw her. "You look tired, sweetheart," he said as they hugged. "I am," Michelle admitted, "more than I realized." They talked for hours about her mother, gone now for 5 years, about his garden, about small memories from her childhood, and then, slowly, about Brian, about how things had gotten this way, about how much she carried, and how little he seemed to see it. Her father listened quietly, then spoke with a gentleness that made her eyes sting. "You know," he said, "your mother once packed a suitcase and left for a day. I thought she was leaving me. Turns out she just needed me to notice everything I had stopped seeing. It changed me, Michelle. Sometimes love needs a shock to wake it up." As dusk settled over the city, Michelle walked home in the fading light, her phone still off, her steps unhurried. For the first time in a long time, she didn't dread walking through that front door. Something had shifted in her and maybe, just maybe, in Brian too. The diner was nearly empty by the time Michelle and her father settled into a booth by the window. Rain streaked the glass outside, soft and steady, while the smell of brewed coffee hung warm in the air. Her father, Thomas Avery, had always been a man of few words, solid, dependable, the kind of person who never panicked even when life spun out of control. It was part of why Michelle had called him. She didn't need someone to fix things. She needed someone who understood storms. They talked about small things at first, the stubborn tomato plant still clinging to life in his garden, the book club he'd reluctantly joined at the community center. But when the conversation drifted toward Brian, Michelle's tone shifted. The words poured out before she could stop them. "I don't even know who we are anymore," she admitted, staring into her cup. "I work. I pay the bills. I keep the house running. And he's always waiting for the right opportunity. But what about us? What about me?" Her father listened without interrupting. nodding slowly as she spoke. When she fell silent, he leaned back in the booth and exhaled. "You know," he said after a long pause, "you're not the first woman in this family to feel that way." Michelle looked up. "What do you mean?" He smiled faintly, but there was sadness in his eyes. "Your mother. About 30 years ago, I lost a big contract at the construction firm. We were drowning in debt, I was angry all the time, and I stopped trying. I told myself I'd figure it out, but really, I was hiding from the shame." Michelle's heart tightened. She remembered flashes of that time, the tension, the arguments she didn't understand as a child. "One afternoon," Thomas continued, "I came home and found your mother packing a suitcase. I panicked. I asked her where she was going, and she looked me in the eye and said, 'I'm not going anywhere yet, but I will if you keep living like this. Be a man or lose your family.'" The words seemed to hang in the air between them. "She gave me a choice," he said quietly, "and that shock, it changed everything. I started taking whatever work I could. It wasn't glamorous, but it kept food on the table. And little by little, I built myself back up. We built us back up." Michelle swallowed hard. "You never told me that." "Because I didn't want you to see me as someone who failed," he admitted. "But the truth is, even the strongest marriages hit storms. And only when both people row the boat does it move forward. One person rowing alone just spins in circles." His words sank deep, finding places she hadn't wanted to look. All this time, she had believed she was helping Brian by carrying the weight. But maybe she had been enabling him, building a soft landing so he never had to stand up again. Every bill paid, every meal prepared, every excuse tolerated had become another brick in the wall of his stagnation. "I think I've been rowing alone for a long time," she murmured. Thomas reached across the table and squeezed her hand. "Then maybe it's time to stop." Back at the Carter house, the afternoon had stretched into something resembling chaos. Brian was hunched over the kitchen counter, a potato peeler clutched awkwardly in his hand. It had taken him 30 minutes to peel half a bag, and they were uneven and ragged. The frying pan smoked from a forgotten splash of oil. Emma sat at the table, chewing on a dry piece of bread. "Dad," she said between bites, "Mom usually puts spices in the soup, and vegetables, and actual flavor." Brian sighed, staring at the pot of cloudy broth bubbling unevenly on the stove. "I'm doing my best, kiddo." Lucas came in from taking out the trash, wiping his hands on his jeans. "You forgot recycling again," he said. "Mom always separates it. Also, we're out of paper towels." Brian blinked. "We are." "Yeah, Mom keeps track of that too." The comments weren't meant to be cruel, but they hit their target anyway. Brian looked around the kitchen and saw what had always been invisible to him: the dozens of small, unseen tasks that kept their home running, the pantry that never ran empty, the laundry that appeared folded and clean, the trash that disappeared before it overflowed, the meals that appeared hot and ready every evening. He had never truly noticed them because they had always been done, quietly, efficiently, without complaint. And now, standing in the middle of a kitchen that smelled faintly of burnt oil and desperation, he finally understood just how much work that invisible labor required. By late afternoon, the house was a mess. The sink was stacked with dirty dishes. The trash still wasn't out. The soup was barely edible. Emma's soccer gear was unwashed. Brian slumped into a chair, staring at the chaos that had bloomed in Michelle's absence. For the first time, a thought pierced the haze of his excuses. She does all of this. Every single day, he felt a flicker of shame, and underneath it, something unfamiliar and uncomfortable: respect. Maybe he hadn't just been out of work these past 2 years. Maybe he had been absent from his family in far more ways than one. As the daylight outside began to fade, the Carter house was quiet again, but not with the familiar hum of routine. This was a heavier quiet, the kind that comes before something changes. The sky was already darkening when Michelle turned onto her street that Saturday evening. The rain had stopped, leaving the pavement slick and gleaming under the streetlights. She walked slowly, her phone still switched off, savoring the final few minutes of solitude before stepping back into her other life, the one that had been waiting for her all day. As she reached the front door, she paused and took a deep breath. Then she pushed it open. The smell hit her first, a mix of burnt oil, damp laundry, and something sour from the overflowing trash. The kitchen looked like a small disaster zone. Pots and pans piled in the sink, half-peeled potatoes scattered across the counter, a pot of grayish soup abandoned on the stove. A trail of muddy footprints crossed the floor, and a mountain of damp clothes slumped on the couch. Lucas was at the table, hunched over a sandwich that looked hastily thrown together, while Emma sat on the floor next to a pile of unfolded laundry, looking utterly defeated. When they saw her, both children leapt up and rushed toward her. "Mom!" Emma cried, wrapping her arms around Michelle's waist. "Where were you? We didn't know what to do." "I told you I'd be back tonight," Michelle said softly, smoothing her daughter's hair. Her eyes moved to Brian, who was standing by the sink, looking like a man caught in a crime scene. "I didn't know what to do," he blurted out, gesturing helplessly at the chaos. Everything just fell apart. Michelle set down her purse and met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. "I figure it out every day, Brian. No one ever asks me how." The words landed like a stone in still water. Brian looked away, shame creeping across his face. Lucas shifted uncomfortably. Emma clung tighter to Michelle's arm. And for the first time in a long time, Michelle didn't feel resentment rising in her chest. She felt something quieter, steadier, satisfaction. Finally, they could see the invisible labor she carried. Finally, they understood. The rest of the evening passed in silence. Michelle didn't clean the kitchen. She didn't fold the laundry or scrub the floors. She reheated some leftover soup and called it dinner. It wasn't good, but no one complained. They ate quietly, each person lost in their thoughts, the tension heavy but necessary. When morning came, the house was still a mess. Brian shuffled into the kitchen and poured cereal into bowls, without a word. No pancakes, no bacon, no coffee brewing in the pot, just dry cereal and milk. Lucas poked at it without enthusiasm. Emma didn't say anything at all. Michelle sat at the table with them, her back straight and her eyes steady. "I want to say something," she began, her voice cutting through the silence. "I'm done pretending this is normal. It's not." Brian looked up, startled. "What are you talking about?" "I'm talking about this," she said, gesturing to the kitchen, to the piles of laundry, to the weight she had carried alone for years. "I don't want Lucas growing up thinking it's acceptable for a man to lie on a couch while someone else does everything. And I don't want Emma believing that being a woman means carrying everyone else's burdens without complaint." "Michelle, I am searching," Brian protested. "I've been applying. I'm trying." "Scrolling through job sites isn't working," she shot back, her tone still even but sharper now. "It's been 2 years. 2 years of excuses. 2 years of not the right fit. Meanwhile, I'm working full-time, raising our kids, running this house, and somehow I'm the only one who seems to notice how much is falling apart." Brian's jaw tightened. "I'm doing my best." "No, Brian," she said, leaning forward slightly. "You're doing the bare minimum and calling it effort." The room fell silent again. The kids avoided looking at either of them. Michelle inhaled deeply, steadying herself. "This isn't a threat. It's a boundary. You have 1 month to find a job. Any job. It doesn't have to be perfect. It just has to be something. If you don't, I will make a decision about our marriage." The words hung heavy in the air. Brian's spoon clinked against his bowl as he set it down. "Are you saying you'll leave?" "I'm saying I won't keep living like this," Michelle replied. "If nothing changes, I will." Brian stared at her, as if seeing her clearly for the first time. She wasn't angry, wasn't shouting, and somehow that was worse. The calm in her voice made the ultimatum feel irreversible. a line drawn cleanly in the sand. For the rest of breakfast, no one spoke. Emma excused herself to her room. Lucas muttered something about a group project and left the table. Brian sat there long after they were gone, his cereal turning soggy, his hands motionless on the table. Michelle stood and began clearing the dishes. But this time she didn't do it silently. "This is the last month I carry this alone," she said quietly. "After that, either we're rowing together, or I'm getting off the boat." Brian didn't respond. He couldn't. The weight of her words pressed down on him, heavier than any silence they'd shared before. And deep down, beneath the defensiveness and pride, something in him shifted, a flicker of fear, yes, but also of understanding. This wasn't just about a job anymore. It was about the life they had built, and how easily it could crumble if he didn't change. Monday morning arrived with a strange stillness, one Michelle hadn't felt in years. It wasn't that the house was suddenly peaceful. The sink was still piled with dishes, and Emma had left her backpack in the hallway again. But something inside her had shifted. Speaking her truth the day before had peeled away a weight she hadn't even realized she'd been carrying. For the first time in years, she didn't feel invisible. She felt solid, present, like her life still belonged to her. She dressed for work without rushing, even stopping to sip her coffee slowly instead of gulping it down between chores. When she stepped outside, the November air felt different too, still cold and damp, but sharper, clearer. As she boarded the bus and watched the city slide by, she felt a flicker of something that had been missing for far too long. Possibility. At the office, the usual Monday chaos buzzed around her. Phones ringing, printers whirring, coworkers comparing weekend plans. Michelle logged into her computer and began her day, diving into the familiar rhythm of spreadsheets and invoices. It wasn't glamorous work, but it was steady and she was good at it. Just before lunch, her manager, Elaine, stopped by her desk. "Got a minute?" she asked, her tone light but purposeful. Michelle followed her to the small glass-walled office at the end of the hall. Elaine smiled. "I'll get straight to it. We're expanding the department next quarter, and I need someone to step into a senior accountant role. Higher pay, more responsibility. You're the obvious choice." Michelle blinked, caught off guard. Months ago, she might have turned it down, too worried about how she'd balance it with everything waiting for her at home. But now, as she thought of the ultimatum she'd given Brian, of the line she had drawn in the sand, something steadier rose in her chest. "Yes," she said, "I'll do it." Elaine grinned. "I knew you'd say that. We'll go over the details later this week." After the meeting, Michelle sat at her desk for a long time, fingers hovering over the keyboard, heart still racing. The raise would mean more breathing room, maybe even a small safety net if things didn't change at home. But more than that, saying yes had reminded her that her life wasn't frozen. It was still moving, still hers to shape. That afternoon, Lena called as Michelle was leaving the office. "Well," her friend demanded, "did he snap out of it?" "I gave him a month," Michelle said simply. "Find a job, or I'll decide what happens next." Lena let out a low whistle. "Good for you. And just so you know, if he doesn't change, there are plenty of men who would appreciate a woman like you." Michelle smiled faintly. "I'm still married, Lena." "Yeah," Lena said. "But marriage isn't supposed to feel like a cage." The conversation lingered in Michelle's mind as she walked home. Maybe it wasn't a cage, but it had felt like one for too long. And now, for the first time, she was holding the key. When she opened the door, she expected to find Brian in his usual spot on the couch. Instead, he was at the dining table with his laptop open, typing furiously. A stack of printed resumes sat beside him. He looked up when she walked in. "I updated everything," he said quickly as if needing her to know. "I've applied to 4 jobs today." Michelle hung up her coat and studied him for a moment. He looked different, still uncertain, still defensive, but there was a tension in his shoulders she hadn't seen before. A man who was finally aware of what was at stake. "I didn't think you were serious," he admitted quietly. "Not until yesterday." I was, she said simply. I am. At dinner that night, the conversation turned to Victor's job lead. I'm meeting him tomorrow, Brian said, his voice tight. They want someone for a client manager role. It's not glamorous, but it's something. Michelle nodded. That's good. I'm terrified, he added with a humorless laugh. It's been 2 years since I interviewed for anything. Maybe being terrified is a good sign, she said. It means you're awake. The rest of the meal passed quietly, but the silence felt different from the heavy kind that used to fill their kitchen. This one was edged with uncertainty, but also with the faintest trace of movement, like something long frozen beginning to thaw. Later, as they sat in the living room, Brian stared at the darkened television. I need to tell you something, he said, not looking at her. It's not just laziness. Part of me, I felt ashamed. The idea of taking a job that pays less than my old one, it felt like admitting I'd failed, that I wasn't providing for my family. Michelle listened, her jaw tightening. Do you think I wasn't ashamed? She asked quietly. Carrying the whole family alone, explaining to our kids why we couldn't afford things, working myself into the ground while you waited for something better to fall into your lap. Brian flinched. I didn't mean, I know, she said, her voice softening but not losing its edge. But shame isn't an excuse to stop showing up. We all feel it. The difference is what we do next. He was silent for a long moment. Then, in a voice barely above a whisper, he asked, If I get this job, if I change, do you think we could start over? Michelle looked at him, really looked at him, and saw the man she had once built a life with, now stripped of excuses and pride. I don't know, she admitted. I don't want to be in a marriage just because we signed a piece of paper. I want a partner who values me, not someone who expects me to disappear into the background. Brian nodded slowly, the weight of her words settling over him. For once, there were no promises, no easy reassurances, just the fragile possibility of something new, if he was willing to fight for it. 3 weeks later, the alarm clock in the Carter house rang before dawn. Not for Michelle, but for Brian. He swung his legs out of bed before the sun had fully risen, showered, dressed in a crisp shirt and tie that hadn't seen daylight in years, and brewed a pot of coffee. The sound of his footsteps moving through the kitchen was still strange, almost foreign, but it no longer startled Michelle awake. She stirred under the covers, listening to the quiet clatter of mugs and the front door closing as he left for work. It was a sound she had once taken for granted, and one she had stopped believing she would ever hear again. True to his word, Brian had taken the job at Keystone Building Supplies. It wasn't the executive position he used to brag about, and the paycheck was smaller than what they had once lived on. But it was a job. It was structure. It was effort. Every morning, he rose early and caught the 7:10 bus downtown. Every evening, he returned tired but carrying a paycheck, proof that the weight of their life was no longer hers alone. The change was subtle at first, almost fragile, but slowly the air in the house began to shift. Lucas no longer rolled his eyes when Brian spoke about responsibility. Emma, once distant and wary, started sitting beside her father after dinner, telling him about her day. Even the arguments that had once flared between them seemed to quiet. There were still dishes to wash and bills to pay, but they no longer felt like burdens Michelle carried in isolation. For her part, Michelle found herself exhaling in ways she hadn't in years. With a promotion on the horizon, her days at the firm had taken on new purpose. She stayed a little later at work, not because she had to, but because she wanted to. She joined 2 colleagues for lunch instead of eating alone at her desk. On Saturday mornings, she walked to the small farmers' market downtown, picking out flowers and fresh bread just because they made her happy. It was in those quiet, unremarkable moments, sipping tea on the porch before sunrise, browsing shelves in the bookstore after work, taking an evening walk alone, that Michelle felt the stirrings of something she had long forgotten, herself. She had spent years shrinking to fit the spaces around her, the needs of her children, the fragility of Brian's pride, the endless churn of responsibility. A month ago, she could barely remember the woman she had once been. Curious, independent, capable of joy. She had been invisible, even to herself. Now, standing in front of the mirror one morning before work, she saw someone else staring back. Still tired, yes. Still uncertain, but no longer invisible. Brian was trying, she would give him that. He came home every day with small stories about clients and deliveries, about the challenges of learning a new system after years away. He folded laundry without being asked, helped Emma with her science project, even started cooking dinner twice a week. It wasn't perfect. There were still moments when frustration flared, when old habits tugged at the edges of their fragile new rhythm. But it was movement, slow, tentative, imperfect movement. One evening, as they sat together in the living room after the kids had gone to bed, Michelle found herself thinking about how much had changed in so little time. For weeks ago, she had stood in this same room feeling utterly trapped, exhausted, unseen, and terrified that her life would never change. Now, the fear was still there, but it no longer owned her. The future was uncertain. Maybe Brian would grow into the man she needed him to be. Maybe he would slip back into old patterns once the shock of her ultimatum faded. Maybe their marriage would evolve into something stronger, or maybe it would end. She didn't know. But for the first time in years, that uncertainty didn't scare her. It felt like possibility. As she tidied the kitchen that night, Michelle caught sight of the sticky note still pinned to the refrigerator. "I have things to do. I'll be back tonight." She had left it there as a quiet reminder, not just of the day she walked out, but of the day she chose herself. Brian walked in, loosening his tie, looking tired but content. "Long day," he said with a weary smile. "I know the feeling," she replied, and they shared a small, genuine smile across the room. Later, as she slipped into bed and the house settled into sleep around her, Michelle stared up at the ceiling and thought about all the versions of herself she had been. The woman who carried it all, the woman who vanished for a day, the woman who drew a line in the sand. She knew now she would never go back to the first version. Life, she realized, was too short to wait for someone else to grow up, too precious to spend on promises that never arrive. Whatever came next, whether this new chapter lasted or not, she would walk into it with her eyes open, her voice steady, and her worth no longer negotiable. And for the first time in a long time, that was enough.